Show. It is Tuesday, September 30th, 2025. On today's program, we are going to talk about things in the news, primarily the looming shutdown of the U.S. government. And I want to chat a little bit about the meeting of the top generals in the U.S. taking place at Quantico. Then in our more meaty segment, we're going to talk today about insurance from a biblical perspective. It ties into our discussions yesterday of biblical and Christian principles of economics, but insurance in the Christian world is something also to be seen. So I'm looking forward to having you with that, and let's just unpack all that on this edition of the Steve Beaman Show.
In a world of uncertainty, where business, freedom, and the future hang in the balance, one voice rises with clarity, experience, wisdom, and conviction. This is the Steve Beaman Show, the voice of the independent American.
Well, I'm glad to be back with you and glad to have a chance to speak again. And thank you, by the way, for the folks who are responding and writing questions and comments to steve@stevebeaman.com. I really like it. I love interacting with you. And the ideas that you're giving me will make this a better and better opportunity for us to be together. But on today's show, I want to talk about the looming shutdown of the U.S. government. That's going to happen tonight at midnight, September 30th at 11:59 p.m. The U.S. government runs out of operating money. Well, so what that means is tomorrow when you wake up, the federal government will be shut down. Okay, so what? What does that mean? Well, I've lived through an awful lot of these in my life, and I will tell you from historical perspective, it doesn't mean a whole lot. The fact of the matter is when the government shuts down, the necessary things like writing checks for Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, all that goes on. The military is still in force, it goes on. The intelligence agencies, they still go on. Everything that's not essential to day-to-day operations continues. So it's really not a big thing for you and me. This time could be a little bit different in that the administration has threatened to fire tens of thousands of federal workers. And that's a big deal because that in the area of Virginia and Washington, D.C. could be material a hit on their economy. Now, that's been interesting, by the way, and you've heard me talk about this. Since last year, we've seen since 23 and 24 and then into 25 a transition in the growth of jobs from the government sector into the private sector. So we've already reduced the growth of government employment. This would be further trimming the government employment, and I think the administration very much wants to do that. So I think you could see very easily a hit to some of those folks who might get fired. And our hearts would go out for them. I don't wish ill on anybody, and I know it'll be disruptive and dislocative for them. But by the same token, we need to get government under control. And little things like this, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. The other thing going on today is this military meeting in Quantico, and you've all heard about it, where we have all of the major flag officers, the generals and the naval, admirals and everybody else joining together for a meeting with Secretary of War, Defense, Pete Hegseth. Let me digress for just a minute, and I want to share with you why I call it the Secretary of Defense still and not the Secretary of War. The titles to the administrative departments, whether it's the Department of Treasury, Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, those are set by Congress, not by the president. Now, the president has the authority short term through an executive order to change the operating title to Secretary of War. But ultimately, it's Congress that has to set that title. And until they do that, I still think of it as Secretary of Defense. I don't think it's a big deal. But what we've basically seen is Secretary Hegseth going in and just talking with the, again, these major tops of the general staff officers about wanting to change the orientation a bit. Since World War II, the U.S. military has become very top-heavy. And I think they want to change that. We'd rather have more field personnel, non-officers, enlisted men, and more lieutenants and captains than we would generals. And we're just too top-heavy, and I think they want to reorient the U.S. toward a more efficient and effective military force, and that's what this is about. We did have a lot of speculation last week that it might be a prelude to war, or maybe they were preparing for war. I don't think any of that is really true. I think it's just a restructuring and the secretary wanting to make it crystal clear that everybody should be on that page. So he certainly did awaken everybody by having them all attend. And by the way, they're all in contact with their respective commands. It's not like they're out of contact. They all have phones and everything else. So it's not, there's a high security risk to them all being there. I'm sure that there's no fly zones, but other than that, I don't think it's a big deal. So tomorrow, when we convene, we will be talking about the government shutdown. I think it's going to happen. The reason for that, by the way, really this time around seems to be the Democrats. A lot of times in my life, when there's been a shutdown, it's the intransigence of the Republicans that causes a shutdown. This time, it's pretty clearly the Democrats. What they're trying to do, just to bring you up to speed, and if you don't know it, you should, they are at 11:59 tonight, the U.S. government runs out of authorized money to continue. So what they do is they pass what's called a continuing resolution. And what that means is tomorrow when you wake up, it's just like it was the day before. It continues what was in place. The Republicans have asked for a 13-week continuing resolution to give them time to put together the budgets they need to do to fund the government. The Democrats have said, well, we're not going to sign that because we don't like what it continues. We don't like cuts to Medicaid, we don't like cuts to Medicare, and we don't like cuts to the insurance subsidies of Obamacare. Now, the Republicans' pushback is, well, we didn't cut Medicare and Medicaid, we cut the increase. We reduced growth in those programs. And the same is true with the Obamacare stuff. We cut the growth and we put in work requirements and did things like that. Regardless, they're saying, don't shut the government down over this. Give us 13 weeks and we can negotiate that out. It doesn't look like the 7 Democrats that are needed are going to do this. I think the Republicans have 53 votes lined up right now. They need 60. So without those additional 7 votes, the Democrats saying, okay, we'll sign a continuing resolution to keep it going. Without that, the government will shut down. Again, it's not a big deal. I don't think you're going to even notice it for the most part. But, these things happen regularly, and it rarely has any effect at all. The big time thing this time, again, if Trump goes out and he fires tens of thousands of federal workers, that would be a big impact, at least on the government. But by the way, on that, I want to pass along a bit of good news that I want to talk about it because I've had a lot of people interviewed that I've been interviewed by who've asked my opinion on the economy, and I'm always big to say, well, we have 37 trillion in debt, we have 2 trillion in deficits, and we have this much in trade deficits and all this stuff. Well, on the deficit itself, I've been wrong, and I want to admit it, and I give kudos to the administration. At the beginning of the year, our deficit was running north of $2 trillion a year. Now it's down below 1.9 and decreasing. Now, the reason for that is this tariff. The tariffs are bringing in a lot of money, and that money is reducing our deficits daily. Well, that's a good thing because to get control of our debt, you have to first get control of your deficits. And the fact that we're bringing it down like we are, it's a bit of a surprise to me. Frankly, I didn't think it would happen. And it's not been inflationary. Even Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, said this has been a surprise to him, that it has not been an inflationary tariff situation. So it looks like Trump pulled this one out. Time will tell, and the markets are still looking maybe to see what happens in the fourth quarter. But generally speaking, we've had the best of all worlds. We've brought in on an annual basis $400-500 billion, and we have not seen inflation from this. So there's much to celebrate there, especially for the futures of our children and our grandchildren who will suffer mightily from these deficits if they continue. Again, we'll update on that regularly. I watch it constantly. The markets, in response to all this, are kind of flat. They're not really. You had the typical Bitcoin went up, the VIX went up. So the kind of responses you'd expect when there's that much instability in the markets, but I don't think you're going to see much of anything. So I want to shift into our more meaty program, and I want to talk today about insurance as under the auspices, again, of biblical economics. We talked about this yesterday because I am a firm believer that we're in the midst of a massive transition. I've been talking about it for 15 years. We're starting to see it a little bit in real time, but I think we've seen just the tip of the iceberg. We are moving from the industrial capitalism that we've always known into a digital capitalism. And what I mean by that is a capitalism which the rules that we've always lived by, of as fundamental as supply and demand, may not apply anymore. There may be unlimited supply. It's demand management. We could see a world that dislocates large chunks of the working population through automation, AI, etc. Again, we're seeing some of that in real time now. So this dislocation and this move to the digital economy made me start thinking about how is this going to work for the average, normal, everyday person if they don't have a foundation in faith. The Bible teaches us to build our houses upon stone, so they can withstand a storm, as opposed to building a house on sand. Well, in your economic philosophy, and I talked yesterday about how, as I've come to understand after 40 years in economics and finance, economics is philosophy. It truly is. As you look at your own philosophy of economics, I hope you'll frame it in the idea of biblical economics, because having that foundation, being biblical in how you look at things, will give you the kind of strength to withstand the storms that we are going to face in the next 10 years as the digital revolution comes to life. So we talked about that, and I wanted then to move in today to insurance, because I think there are misconceptions of insurance. I think there is, in some segments of our society, a belief that it's an entitlement, which it's not. It is very much a privilege. It's not a right at all. It's a privately offered service. And I want to talk about it so we have a common ground for understanding. If you think about what insurance is, at the core, it's risk management. You are saying to somebody, I want to offload my risk. And you're going to do that. And so you go to them privately and say, what will you charge me to take over my risk? I drive a car. What is it that you're going to charge me to manage that car insurance? That's a free transaction. And they're going to look and say, statistically, we know it's going to cost us this much money to have you driving that car, so we're going to charge you that plus a profit. Now, again, the old days, you could choose or not choose to have that insurance. Today, it's a little bit different. But we want to begin to look at principles of stewardship as it relates to risk management. And that's an important concept, because we talked yesterday about we are not owners of ourselves, of our families, of our resources, of our homes. They belong to God and to God alone. We are stewards over those things for the time we are here on earth. Now, sometimes we do a good job at that. Sometimes we don't. And I've certainly been on all sides of that equation. But stewardship simply puts your mindset to understand that you are responsible to manage this for His purposes. Therefore, risk management becomes part of stewardship. The Bible's filled with stories of risk. I mean, one of the funniest ones that I've used as an example is Noah. Well, there was, it depends who you talk to, but in most agreed upon stuff, it was agreed that there really was no rain before Noah. So people, when he said it's going to rain and we're going to have this flood, people said, what are you talking about? We're not going to have any rain. But he had a risk of there's going to be, the Lord is telling me there's going to be. So he mitigated that risk by building an ark. He, of course, was right, and the people who didn't follow that risk management got badly hurt. But risk has been with us forever. And we're taught in Scripture to be faithful with what we've been given and to be prudent with what we've been given. And managing risk, therefore, is part of that stewardship. So as you look at your own world and you look at the risks that you're taking, whether it's in your health, your house, your cars, your family, your business, whatever that might be, if you understand that you're going to transfer that risk voluntarily to another, well, understand what they do with it, because it ain't free. But clearly, I'm just switching some stuff here. I'm going to switch because I'm going to talk about examples and preparedness. And I talked about Noah. And by the way, this is new that I can do this. I'm using a new technology called OBS, and it allows me to put up slides and stuff. So as we continue forward, I'm hoping to make the show more interesting. Instead of just looking at me on camera and listening to me, we'll be able to get slides and things like that to do more of a masterclass or a webinar on these things. But as we look at the principles of, this idea of ethical examples of participation in risk management, we look first at the notion of God owning everything and us being stewards over what we've been given, and that we are to prepare for uncertainty. We have to, because we know uncertainty exists. The Bible says we don't know the day and the time. We don't. We have no idea what tomorrow holds. None. So we insure against the risk that tomorrow holds something not great. Health, car accident, whatever it might be. Now, there are ways to handle insurance as a loving thing. And, talking about loving our neighbor. And I want to talk here primarily about alternatives to traditional health insurance. And I'm not paid by this company, but I'm a big fan of it, and that's MediShare. What MediShare does is say to an individual, you can offload the risk of your medical issues to this group of believers. So that if you have a problem, you submit it to the group and they pay for your medical care. Similarly, you then pay to participate in others' care. It's a community-based Christian organization that manages risk at that level of community. That, to me, is new. But if you can abide in their rules, you can share your risk. It's a very inexpensive way, comparatively, to get health insurance. And it's done out of loving your neighbor. It's done out of a concern for your neighbor's well-being. Insurance companies, on the other side, do it for profit. Now, as we talked in biblical economics, profit's not bad. Profit in and of itself isn't. Greed is bad. And when you take away the eyes of God and the stewardship and you say, I'm in this just for me and I want more for me, that's greed and that's unhealthy. Insurance companies typically, especially in the more credible ones, aren't as greedy as you think. They make a fair return on their investment. And most of these numbers you could dispute a little bit, but I think it's around a 5 to 6% return on investment. They're not ridiculously profitable. You say, well, my rates keep going up. Their costs keep going up. Keep in mind, when you take health insurance from Blue Cross, what you're doing is saying, I take my risk of a health problem and I'm giving it to you. Well, they're looking at it saying, okay, if you have a heart attack, it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars. If you have cancer, it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars. If you have all kinds of things, it's going to be very expensive. So they weigh out the risk of you getting that based on their probability tables and statistical tables and actuarial tables. They're very accurate. And they say, well, it's going to cost us this much to cover you. That's your base rate. And then they add profit to it. It's not ridiculous, and it's not overwhelmingly favorable to the insurance companies. Now, here in Illinois, we got notice that Aetna, I think it is, isn't covering health anymore. And that's because when Aetna looks at you and says, I will take your risk of a health problem, the government comes in and tells Aetna they can't charge a fair price. So Aetna says, you know what, I can't afford it. I'd go broke if I insured you. It's like under the notion of Obamacare, where you have guaranteed acceptance. How long do you think risk management works if I get cancer and then I go get insurance? Well, that's not insurance at that point. I'm not managing a risk. I'm managing a reality. But we're seeing more and more of that. So what does that do to the rest of us? Raises our rates. What do you think happens when people that are here, I'll say the phrase, illegally, go in and use our hospitals, which the hospitals are mandated to treat people who come through their door? What happens? Because those people can't pay, the hospital has to charge everybody else, which means the insurance companies have to charge more. So it's the inefficiencies in that whole system that are causing these insurance companies, and I'm not paid by the insurance companies. I'm just telling you the way it works. They have to keep raising rates because their costs keep going up. Now, as a biblical Christian, when you're looking at this, you can say, well, it is absolutely, what would I say, the real world that we want to not put into this system fear and greed. And I put that up there. We see fear played in the insurance world because the insurance industry will scare you into buying more insurance than you need. And we see greed from two standpoints. We see it from people who don't want to pay for it but want the benefit of it, and the companies who at some point sometimes do say, we're going to charge what we can rather than what we need to. Those two things go in conflict. If you have fear and greed in the insurance system, it messes it up. The other thing that does is government regulation. I've been interviewed on TV a lot of times about this, and one of the things that is extremely important to understand is in health insurance, one of the major inefficiencies of health insurance is simply that you can't buy health insurance across state lines. A provider selling insurance in New Jersey cannot sell that insurance in Illinois. So there's a restricted amount of companies that can sell in any given state, and that's part of what causes prices to be so out of whack. There's no competition. Well, if we want to improve competition and put that back in, we have to allow companies to sell wherever they want to sell. That's number one. Number two is the regulations put on through the healthcare system. For example, I'm required to have maternity care. I don't know about you, but I'm a 63-year-old man. I can't get pregnant. But they require me to do it in the idea of spreading the risk of the maternity care across more people to reduce the cost of it. Okay, that's inefficient and it's not right, but they do it. Those kinds of things are inefficient, wrong costs thrown onto the system. So when you're looking to manage your risk, you end up paying more than you actually should because the systems are inefficient. But as you go into this and you say, as a biblical Christianity, how can I put insurance into that framework? Realize that as a steward over God's devices, you have the responsibility to manage their risk. You have to fairly evaluate the risk, and then you have to buy the appropriate tool or offload it for the appropriate tool. One of the things I find in people frequently is they're overinsured, especially on life insurance. If you're in your late 60s, early 70s, and you and your wife are financially secure and your kids are grown, why do you have insurance? You don't need to provide for your wife if you die. You don't need to provide for your kids if you die. You'll now see companies coming out to the silver tsunami saying, hey, we'll buy your life insurance. Of course they will. It's very profitable. They give you a very small payment of what it's worth, and they know actuarially how long you're going to live. So they can put a very real bet on that, and it's right. So more and more people are taking the reverse insurance policy programs and selling their insurance. I can't argue with that. I think it's prudent. Then use that money to serve more of God's purposes. It could be your grandkids' education. It could be a vacation for you, which is not ungodly. That's necessary. All of these good things that can happen when you look prudently at what you're doing. I can only say this with respect to insurance. Don't overinsure, but make sure you look at your risk realistically. If you own a car, and I've had circumstances with younger people especially where they say, I don't want to insure the car, I just want to insure the risk of hitting somebody else. They don't get the comprehensive coverage. Think twice about that. Because if that risk of something unknown happens to your car, you're now out the cost of the car. Now, most often when you buy a car on financing payments, you have to have insurance. But there are circumstances when you may own the car and you think it's a lot cheaper just to insure it if I do something. Well, realize that bad things happen. They always do, and you need to be insured to protect against that, and then not have that come in and be a material hurt as a steward over the Lord's resources and money. So it's food for thought. So as we go down, what I've tried to do today is talk about the idea that insurance can be put into the framework of biblical economics, absolutely, as a risk management tool. Again, Noah did it, Joseph did it when he put away the grains. We have to know that ultimately the Lord is in control, so we don't buy it out of fear. We buy it out of prudence. And as such, we don't buy more than we should. and we don't let people sell us more than we should have. Insurance can be a valuable part of your daily activities, whether, again, it's health, disability, car, whatever it might be. You're managing that risk. But do so understanding what the structure of the costs are and what they'll be, because they're going to be expensive, and they're going to get more expensive as we transition in society to more and more expectations on the insurance companies. That's not free. Every time government says insurance companies have to cover that, you pay for it. So it's something to obviously think about. I guess I would just leave you with that. Tomorrow when we get together, we're going to talk about the government shutdown, and we're going to do more because, again, the reason for me doing this is this digital economy at the kind of the root cause, because I believe we're headed toward an economy that's going to be massively dislocative. And I want you to be prepared for it. I want to have your foundation set on things that won't shake and shimmy as this transition comes along. But I want to thank you for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for another episode of The Steve Beaman Show.